Hey everyone, welcome to episode 78 of the Every Thought Captive podcast, where we try to talk about what we think about in a way that honors Jesus. I'm here with Chad and producer Jeff, and one of my very best friends in the world, and our colleague, professor, teacher here at Ozark, Mike Ackerman. Mike, it's good to have you, man.
Mike.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, this is the first time we've had you on this thing, right?
Yep.
Yeah, super pumped to have you. Mike's been teaching here at Ozark for a decade now.
Getting there,
basically,
yeah.
right?
I think so.
I can't remember how
I lose
it all...
track.
Right, yeah, no, yeah, close to that. So he's been teaching here for a while. Before that, he was a church planner in Japan. And before that, he ministered in Arizona, California. And then before that was college, actually. He actually grew up on the West Coast, came here to Ozark. That's where he and I met, became buddies. And it's been fun to kind of walk this journey. So excited to have you today, man.
Grateful to be here.
Yeah, and so the immediate context for this is, we're approaching Christmas. When this thing comes out, it'll be just around the corner. And so we thought it would be fun to do an episode kind of oriented around the birth narratives. And, Mike, you know this, but for those that don't know, Mike teaches a class called Life of Christ here at Ozark. And if you have been to Ozark in the past, you know this class. It's essentially we put the life of Christ in chronological order. So you're kind of looking across the different Gospels, and then we divide it up into 4 semesters. The first is kind of some preparatory, and then the birth narratives, and probably some of his early ministry, yeah?
Mm-hmm. Yep,
and then
through the Sermon on the Mount.
Is the whole first one? Oh, wow, I forgot you got that far. Mm-hmm. And then the second and third are kind of the middle part of Jesus' ministry, and then the fourth is just the final week of his life. So here's the first question. So we're going to talk, and eventually we'll talk about Christmas and the birth narratives and the incarnation and those sorts of things. But I'm really interested to hear, you've been doing this now, teaching through all 4 Gospels chronologically, literally like at some level, to some degree, covering every verse in all the Gospels every 2 years. You've been doing this for a number of years now.
Yeah.
How has that...
About 6.5 years now.
Is that right? So you went through them all 3 times?
3 times through the cycle.
That's crazy, man.
Wow.
It's so fun. So how has that experience impacted you in general? And then specifically, what are some surprises that you have known and come to know along the way?
Yeah, I mean, in a general sense, it's just a great privilege. I mean, it's a real rich experience. I mean, it's work. I mean, it's a lot of material. I think, honestly, that's even one of the surprises. It's just the sheer quantity of content to cover. By word count, the Gospels make up 47% of the New Testament.
Damn.
Yeah. So
teaching half of it.
Yeah. So just that quantity, the diversity of content, you get genre within genre in the sense of narratives, but then you get a parable, you get a discourse. And so I think just the sheer quantity and diversity of content is in itself a certain impression-making thing as a teacher, because you're having to sort of be attentive to the nuances of each of those genre and in the big picture. I think even just the fact that maybe a particular student's only taking one of the 4 means that there's certain big picture things to talk about, but yet being attentive to the details.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting because each time through, as preachers and teachers, we all experience this all the time, but you learn new things each time. And there are certain things I come through, and it's almost like at this point, I'm more confident in certain things than when I started. Yes, this is absolutely how to think of it. And then other things, it's the opposite. It's like over time, like, you know what?
I've said this for a couple of years, but...
And you're like, well, wait a second. Where's my source on that?
Yeah.
Sometimes it's just insignificant things. Like I was thinking about the Sadducees.
Okay.
Almost anything you read will say, they only read the Torah. And you're like, okay, where do we get that idea? It's literally one line in Josephus where he says they didn't go beyond the laws.
Okay. Huh.
And one interpretation is that they didn't respect the oral tradition.
Okay.
So not that they didn't include the prophets and the writings, but that they were resistant to the ongoing interpretation as authoritative.
Yeah, the tradition of the elders stuff.
Yeah, and there's even a comment in the Mishnah about how, from a Pharisaic standpoint, the Sadducees, they don't trust us, but they'll read Homer. And you're like, really? So I don't... Josephus never mentioned that.
But it's just become conventionally true.
Oh, yeah. You'll see it all over with no citation. Yeah. And it really is Josephus. In fact, that's a surprise into itself, how much we lean on him. Yeah. And I think we should in many cases, but it's still...
We also know that exaggerates and he's one guy and he's got some axes to grind
and he's got a patron that pays for the project. And
Stuff like that is pretty common in New Testament scholarship, though. We were just talking recently, I think, about the cult of Artemis and just how, we just sort of take it for granted that it's there in the primary sources or whatever, but actually it's maybe not quite there. And, you have guys like Scott McKnight out kind of acknowledging that, admitting that, you know.
Right. And so the repetition of getting, okay, now I'm another crack at this text. Let's go a little deeper on not as much here as I thought.
Right.
Whereas when you're teaching a text kind of one and done, you may not get into those.
I think which this is kind of getting more meta about being a professor in general. Like, I think most professors, as they're teaching content semester after semester after semester, like there's this gnawing fact that we're always aware of. Like, I'm so looking forward to teaching this class again because I know that I could do better next time.
Oh my gosh!
Give me another shot at it.
And so, like, I've taught Hebrews for, my goodness, I was trying to calculate it. I think I've taught it 30 times.
Wow.
Have you really?
And, yeah.
When you still say it's like your favorite book to teach or say,
yeah,
right?
But the problem with teaching it that many times is that some things become a little bit more automatic.
Yeah.
But I felt it more this semester than in previous years. Like, oh man, there's some things to tighten up. There's some things that I was really sure of, like in year 5, sort of like what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I was really sure of it in year 5. And now as I say it again, like 10 years later, it's like, I don't know. Am I as sure about that as I thought?
Yeah.
So, absolutely.
Crazy. Mike, how do you, I don't know if there's an answer to this question, how do you worship differently, or how has it impacted your just approach to Jesus as a follower of Jesus to spend that much time meditating, studying and meditating on?
It really is a key. Sometimes we get asked, what's your favorite class you teach?
Right. Yes.
And it's kind of like, well, I love them all.
Yes.
It's like,
depends on who's in the class.
That's one of our secrets.
Yeah.
But the fact that there's so much, there's something about teaching the life of Christ that just gives freshness every semester. Again, in part because even if I'm teaching it every semester, it's one of the 4.
Yes.
So each of them, it's still actually I'm on my 4th time teaching semester 1. So there's a lot to that, I suppose. But the diversity of the person of Jesus in his teachings and gestures and the way he interacts with people, the details are striking. I think also, though, and this is something in particular with the birth narratives, is the sovereignty of God. Often when that subject comes up in a lot of theological conversations, we're talking about somewhat of the philosophical statements about the foreknowledge of God and his predestination of things. But I find the narratives of the gospel really from start to finish as a fascinating pool of material to ponder his sovereignty, the way God is orchestrating things towards his fulfillment. So, okay, the census of Augustus gets this poor couple to Bethlehem. Herod's megalomaniac infanticide gets them to Egypt and back. Archelaus and his unpredictability gets them back to Nazareth. Jesus getting kicked out of Nazareth by the people who knew him growing up gets him to Capernaum. And the gospel writers tell us that each of those are the fulfillment of prophecy.
Yeah.
That actually, that's exactly what God said would happen. And then even you see that, I think, in the events leading up to and surrounding the death of Jesus as well.
Yeah.
That whether it's Caiaphas talking about it being better for one to die for the nation than for the nation to suffer for one, the method of his death. I think you could even argue down to the very final moments of his death. God's in charge.
Yeah.
And so for me, there's been a real richness to just the trust that God can work things out. That in the face of what looks like uncertainty, he's got this.
Right.
And that's, of course, something that has been there for us throughout the Old Testament in terms of if we're just thinking through the unfolding revelation of God. But I think there's a kind of a precision to some of those things.
Yeah.
How do you get a Nazarene born in Bethlehem who's from the line of David.
And retrace the Egypt steps.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How do you
Yeah.
do all that? It's sort of apologetically helpful. Like you couldn't aspire to fulfill all this.
Yeah.
There's no way to orchestrate that complexity. But in terms of devotionally,
Yeah.
it's pretty poignant that God can do this.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. I love that.
Mike, you see, for this Life of Christ class, it's more of a harmonized approach to the four Gospels, kind of laying out the chronological life of Christ over 4 semesters. And we also offer classes here at Ozark on the individual Gospels. So we have a class on each one of the individual Gospels, and each one of those are just 2 different approaches to covering the content.
Yeah. And I'm glad we do both.
Yeah. And both have their values, both maybe have their detriments too. So I'm just curious, what are some of the ways that you hear the Gospels talked about, or maybe used in arguments that you find to be unhelpful or untrue?
Yeah, I think one thing that comes to mind is the way as scholars, sometimes the human author can become the focal point of the study. How Luke is so compassionate in his attentiveness to the outsider, the Gentile, the child, the woman. And I think Luke would say, I mean, that was Jesus.
That was
doing
Jesus.
that.
Yeah.
And I think Matthew would
That's a
say,
good point.
Yeah.
I had Jesus healing
story. Yeah.
people and connecting it to the Isaiah 53 vision of the suffering servant. I showed you how God cares. I was the one having Jesus quote Hosea 6 saying I desire mercy, not sacrifice.
Yeah.
As he's identifying with tax collectors and sinners. So I think sometimes there can be actually an obscuring of Jesus.
Yeah.
With the kind of the fixation on the human author.
On the author.
And so
I've heard that. Yeah. That's a good point. I've heard that a lot.
and that's not to say there aren't clearly distinctives of each in their approach and emphases, and we want to take those very seriously. I mean, Matthew starts with a genealogy and mentions multiple Old Testament texts as being fulfilled. He clearly wants to show Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. But they all make that point. They all show that Jesus is compassionate. They all show that Jesus is God.
Yeah.
Sometimes in surprising ways. But, people talk about the high Christology of John.
Yeah.
For sure. In the beginning was the Word was with God. The Word was God. For sure. But Matthew and Mark and Luke all record Jesus doing things only God does.
Well, I think of the first chapter of Mark, for crying out loud, out of the gate. That quote from Isaiah, which everybody thinks is about John the Baptist, because I suppose in a way it is, but it's more about identifying Jesus with Yahweh.
Yeah.
It's
Prepare
crazy.
the way for the Lord.
Yes.
So who's showing up here? God.
Yeah. But somehow
Very lofty.
Somehow John is the only one that talks about the divinity of Christ. Like, come on.
Right. So almost zooming in on each can almost make you feel like you're making an observation about uniqueness that isn't actually so unique.
Yeah.
And I think studying them in harmony actually helps with that. Of course, it complicates things in terms of taking literary context seriously. I think even on the teaching side, that's one of the challenges, to kind of maintain an attentiveness to literary context,
Right.
Especially, the sort of the sketch we use tends to see Matthew as being a little bit more of a compiler and organizer of things. So taking things out of order.
Right.
And so we might be in chapter 8 when he's doing the healings in Capernaum.
Yeah.
Which means it's in Matthew's account after the Sermon on the Mount, but we study it before the Sermon on the Mount, thinking that's probably when it happened. Matthew's doing some other things there.
Yeah.
So that's complicated.
Well, I was going to ask you that as kind of a follow-up. What are, just for the people listening who don't have the ability to take a college class or whatever on this. So I'm sitting down with my Bible. I want to engage the Gospels well.
Yeah.
Obviously, things like paying attention to the context, super important. Any other words of wisdom that you would give them on here's how you can engage the Gospels well?
Yeah. I mean, at some level, it sounds so pedantic or condescending, but it's like read them all the way through.
Yeah.
Often.
Yeah.
I mean, what a safeguard against idiosyncratic views of Jesus, to just see the whole 47% of the New Testament that we get, just reading it over and over, and acknowledging that's some work. You know, I think sometimes people feel like, is there something wrong with me if this is hard? It's like, no, Luke is long.
Yeah.
You're going to be reading the book of Luke for a while. But do that. So I think seeing them in their totality, seeing them in concert with one another simply through the act of reading, you know, is part of that.
Yeah.
I think there is usefulness. We use the NIV Harmony of the Gospels, Thomas and Gundry.
Right.
It's still out there. Anybody can purchase that.
It's been around for a while.
Yeah. In fact, it hasn't been updated. It's still the 84.
It is old
is
school,
it?
man. We got it in our church little book.
Don't
our
let
resource area.
Zondervan know. Zondervan, man. They're
They've
gonna
been scrubbing the records that existed.
Yeah.
So I know. I've actually wondered, like,
it slipped through the cracks.
do we go to assign that one of these semesters and it's not a thing anymor?
I'm always kind of curious about this, and I've heard differences of opinion depending on who you ask. But if you have a new believer, asking, "Hey, where should I start with Jesus?" Where do you have them start with Mark?
I was literally talking about this in class.
What?
Hey, and do you have a general answer for this that you're about to give?
Well, I was gonna. Yeah.
Okay, I want to do that, and then I want. So my son, you know, Carson, asked me the other day, "Where should I start?"
Yeah.
And so I want you to give your general answer, and then how would you give an answer to my 8-year-old son on this? Yeah.
Well, and
maybe the same. I don't know.
Well, and I've told my sons different things.
Okay. Interesting.
So I try to size up the person.
Okay.
And tailor it accordingly. If someone says, I'm not much of a reader.
Right.
You know, don't take offense to this, Michael. I say, Mark, it's the shortest.
That's why I love teaching it. You know that, dude. Oh, gosh. Yeah.
But honestly, I say, hey, you know, let's bite off something that's manageable here to chew. And that is going to limit certain things.
Yeah.
Not that there's, of course, I mean, there's plenty of richness there. But I do say if they're going to need to read something shorter, I'll go with that. If there's someone who is up for a lengthier read, I usually would give them Luke.
Yeah.
I mean, it is the longest, so you just get that many more texts to look at. If someone's more philosophically oriented, I would recommend John.
Yeah.
If someone's Jewish, I'd recommend Matthew.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly.
That's awesome.
But not only that, if it's someone that's wanting to understand, honestly, if the gospel is their entry point to the Bible as a whole, I would give them Matthew.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
Huh.
Even though it immediately invites, well, wait, who's David? Who's Abraham?
Right.
Those are good questions. Yeah.
But the fact that it forces you to ask those questions, I think, is valuable.
See, now, okay, you also teach a class here that's about the composition of the scriptures and the various versions. Why was Matthew put first? Did it have anything to do with that?
You know, as best I can tell, there is basically over time, it emerges that there's this clear, these are the four.
Yeah.
There's other stories and tellings of the life of Jesus out there. And that for some reason they get attached to the four living creatures.
Okay.
In Revelation and Ezekiel, before the lion, the eagle, the ox, and the person. And that's one of the things I do on like one of the first days or two in Life of Christ is show even Christian art, how
that's cool.
Historically it's been the gospel according to.
Right.
And over time they there's varying versions of, well, which one's which? Who's the ox? But over time, the one that wins is that Matthew's the human or angel, Mark's the lion, Luke's the ox, and John's the eagle.
Yeah.
I think also we take Papias, who thought that Matthew and Mark wrote roughly around the same time in different places. Luke, even by his introduction, sort of says, I sought this out, I researched it. Is Matthew and Mark even among what he researched? Right. Obviously, that's something that scholars scrutinize ad nauseum. And then he says at a later time, John wrote it.
Yeah.
You know, and so I think you get a mixture of kind of the order of the creatures, maybe a close chronology or, you know, a potential chronology of their writing, and it just kind of sticks.
Okay, cool. So what would you tell Carson to read before we move on?
He likes to read, right?
He does like to read.
Give him Luke.
I like that. See, I gave him Mark, but maybe I made the wrong call. I like it.
But you can't go wrong. And that's
no,
the thing.
that's
I
the
like
beauty
to
of
say, man, isn't God generous giving us 4?
Yeah.
He didn't have to.
Yeah.
He gave us 4.
Yeah.
So you can't go wrong.
So one more, we'll kind of get past, one more question that's a little bit, I don't know, kind of meta and also a little bit critical of certain ways of construing these things. And then we'll jump into the Christmas stories.
Cool.
People often play the Gospels, and sometimes like Jesus gets associated with the Gospels against Paul.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask a loaded question.
Yeah.
Why is that a terrible idea that misconstrues both Paul and the Gospels and
Assuming
Jesus?
I think that's terrible?
Right, yeah.
I do, of course.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I know this sounds snarky, but I mean, one of Paul's favorite ways to talk about himself is a slave of Jesus.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think he would be very bothered by the idea that he's somehow pitted against of Jesus, and of course, even his reprimand of the Corinthians.
Yes.
I follow Paul. I follow
Apollos. I follow Christ.
Cephas. I follow Christ. There's one right answer in that list. It's Christ. And so, that sounds snarky, but honestly, I think attitudinally and in the picture we get, there's no conflict here.
Yeah.
And I think all of us here would share a view of inspiration.
Sure, that's true.
That means our hermeneutical method, we need to take them both seriously. Sometimes I bring up in class the idea of the red letter Bible.
Right.
Let's put the words of Jesus in red. Well, first of all, it's probably a translation of what Jesus said. He probably preached in Aramaic. So.
Right. Yeah.
But the idea of maybe those are extra weighty. If our view of inspiration is what it is, then there's just it's from God, understood in context, and in the case of the letters of Paul, occasional documents. I don't think we're eradicating the differences in genre and situation, but still to say these must mesh.
Yeah,
we feel a convictional thing that they need to mesh. And I think when you look at what Paul's trying to do in most of these letters, there is what I like to think of as kind of an inspired theological commentary on the events.
Yeah.
That he understands that this is the kindness of God has appeared is one of the ways he talks about. I think he's alluding to the incarnation.
That's cool. Yes.
Well, Jesus was born. Matthew, Luke record that. Paul,
that's
inspired
his take
by
on
the
it.
Spirit, says the kindness of God appeared.
Yeah.
And that's okay. That's two ways of saying the same thing.
That's good.
It's such a bogus argument, though, because most of the people, or many of the people who make that argument, it's like you're not even pitting Jesus against Paul. You're really pitting Jesus against Jesus too, because you're being very selective about those things that you want to care about and be concerned about, even with the words of Jesus.
Right.
So it's just kind of a sneaky way of slicing and dicing scripture in ways that kind of suit your desires in the moment.
Right. And I suppose there's various versions of this critical framework, but it seems to often connect to justification, atoning sacrifice language. Oh, that's not in the Gospels. Jesus was love your neighbor, live a certain way.
Right.
And I think that's unfair. The gospel writers, it's fascinating that, even the first time we hear what his name's going to be, it's interpreted why that's the name.
Yes.
Yeah.
Name him Jesus because he will save his people from their sins.
Yeah.
And then before he's preached a public sermon, John the Baptist's introduction, look, the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world. And so before he's even gotten going, the gospel writers and John the Baptist, as recorded by the gospel writers, frames it up as saving from sin with sacrificial imagery.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So,
but it's a genre difference, right?
Yeah,
it's the basic difference between epistle or an epistolatory genre and narrative genre, so it's easy to miss those things that Paul makes explicit,
right?
But those things are clearly there in the narrative text.
There. Even you think of Simeon when Jesus is presented, consecrated as the firstborn. He talks about this. He will cause the rising and falling of many, and even to Mary, a sword will pierce your heart. I think most people hear that, knowing where this story goes, as sort of a prophetic insight that, this is going to be a rough road.
Yep.
And it will end in a way that's heart-wrenching for a mother.
Yeah.
So I think if we have the eyes to see and ears to hear, those things are there right up front.
Yeah.
Kind of inclusio,
Yeah.
bookending these documents that Paul comes along later and gives a more philosophical, theological, synthesis statement about. Right. That's fine.
Yep, all
no
true.
problem.
Yeah, and I think about it sometimes negatively and positively. Negatively, there's no not witnessed. Jesus comes by way of witness.
Mm-hmm.
We get access to the true Jesus by apostolic witnesses.
Yeah.
So it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, Paul, John, I messed up that order. And the other, one of the things I always love that I think Seth Wilson used to say this, and I know it's not the only one. For those of you out there, Seth Wilson is the founding dean of our school, and he used to get quoted all the time around here.
Less of us ever met him.
Yeah, no, yeah.
I mean, I met, we've met him, but
yeah.
I mean, we didn't have him as
no, he didn't. Yeah,
teacher.
But he used to talk about. I actually read it in his book, The Mind of Christ, about how when you're reading the letters, that is the voice of Jesus addressing you, and I love that approach.
Yeah.
That it's like no, it really is from him. Okay, let's talk a bit about the birth stories, Mike. So we got a number of questions.
Okay.
Again, let's just start with an easy one. What do you most enjoy about teaching through the birth narratives? The Christmas texts.
One thing that I always say as a joke, but I really do enjoy, is that they hit in September.
Yeah, that is funny. Yeah.
As far as the rhythm of a semester, that's when we get to kind of the birth narrative. And so it's actually not during the normal Christmas season. And in my experience in church, I don't know that I've ever heard a sermon from the birth narratives outside of, December, late November.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, no.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so therefore it's framed up in the sentimentality. And
we did have a student several years ago. This is like one of my first years here teaching. He preached at this tiny little legalistic church, crazy legalistic, so legalistic, in fact, that they wouldn't let him preach on Christmas at Christmas or even on the resurrection at Easter.
Because of pagan
some
holidays?
validation
Pagan holidays,
Wow.
special days, that's how crazy.
Christmas in March.
Yeah. So what he did was every year he preached on the resurrection at Christmas, and he preached on Christmas at Easter time.
Yeah, and honestly, pedagogically, there's something that's nice about let's get a fresh look at this.
Yeah.
And and I try to keep at bay my own dislike for Christmas music and cold weather and the things.
Come on, man.
I know.
Do you like hot chocolate?
Sure. Yeah.
There you go.
But yeah, for those that don't know, this is a real soft side of Chad. He loves Christmas.
Oh, yeah.
All that
absolutely.
stuff. I love that you love
on
it.
our previous episode, we talked about hot Dr. Pepper and lemon. That's my Christmas drink right there. Yeah.
I like it.
Yeah.
I never had it outside of your house.
I'm very sentimental.
I'll try it again this year just for you.
All right.
But honestly,
the fact that you're still a part of this podcast is beyond me as a producer.
But honestly, the fact that it gives us a chance to look at it with, a little bit of a fresh vibe, a little bit removed from the spirit of the season.
Yeah, absolutely.
To say, wow, let's look at, especially since you imagine the original experience, the people experiencing the birth of Jesus, Mary and Joseph and those at the temple who witness him. In some sense, it was any other day, any other year.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's going to be the weirdest thing that ever happened to you if you, are a virgin that conceives a child.
Sure, yeah.
But in terms of, as far as we can tell, going about their business like normal, even the shepherds, out in the field watching their flock, normal day at the office.
Yeah. I have not thought about this. For all the everyday Joe, every average Joe sermons I've heard, I've not really framed it like this.
Yeah.
This is interesting.
That it's a profound act of God intruding into the normalcy,
the mundane.
And at some level, there is a ripeness to the time that we can see. But at the on the other hand, there's a sense in which it is an abrupt act of God stepping in to save his people, and to kind of experience that with a freshness. And then I think one of the other big things that I enjoy is this sovereignty piece that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
That it just really, that there's just so many little details that play out as fulfillment language, as showing God hasn't forgotten his people.
Yeah.
Even one of the benefits of doing it chronologically is actually the first event would have been Zechariah at the altar. In the holy place, lighting incense.
Yeah.
And Gabriel appearing to him. And you just think about how, on the one hand, it's a big opportunity for Zechariah. He's a priest. They probably only did this once in their lifetime. Yeah. And here again, we're using Josephus, by the way, in terms of their customs.
The flow?
Yeah,
That's
the
funny,
way,
yeah. How
how many of them there would have been, how their rotation worked. And so we can kind of do the math that for most people, it'd be a once-in-a-lifetime thing to do the altar of incense. But at the same time, it's a normal day.
Yeah.
And so kind of out of the silence of the intertestamental period, in the confines of the most holy place, God speaks. Gabriel bringing a message to him that a son would be born to him. Of course, that's John the Baptist. So it's not even Jesus yet, which I think helps us bridge the testaments. See, hey, same angel that came to visit Daniel in Babylon is visiting Zechariah here, and the Elijah, the spirit and power of Elijah, he's going to do that. And just kind of weaving those together. So seeing the plan of God, the sovereignty of God bringing about his events. Of course, there's even some irony in the sense that he's the only one to see this happen.
Right.
And then doubts it and comes out silent. So that silence motif is fascinating to me, that, God kind of hasn't spoken in a canonized way, at least.
Yeah.
Depends on your interpretation of the Maccabean stuff.
Right.
But God speaks.
And then
the guy,
I've not noticed
the guy can't hear it or speak, share it.
Well, and I love that, we're talking about the Gentile gospel and the work that is happening to make sure and go almost over the top and connecting it to Israelite realities. And that is our story. This is our story. Okay, cool.
What are some misconceptions people have about the birth narratives? And follow-up question, to what extent should pastors or teachers really lean into correcting those misconceptions?
Right.
Like nativity stuff and whatnot.
Yeah.
That's fun.
Again, I've already outed myself about Christmas music, but I think one misconception is that it was a silent night.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe, but probably more likely screaming, crying.
Yeah.
The anguish of birth.
Yeah.
And the grittiness of that, I think, is what's missed. I mean, just the absolute, you've got a young couple making a 3-day journey leading up to a delivery. I mean, I've yet to meet a woman who says, leading up to, delivery, 3-day donkey ride.
Right.
Let's do that.
Right.
Yeah. But just that kind of earthy, gritty, to use even a word that Philip Yancey uses in Jesus I Never Knew, vulnerable. Feel of it all. It really requires a trust on their part. And just the humanity of it all for Mary and Joseph, the humanity of Jesus, the vulnerability of the whole situation, I think is hard to capture this side of it all when we already kind of know, and it's great. And so I think, I think
that is one of those things where preachers, predominantly male preachers, probably need to check ourselves a little bit. Like this idea of birth, or this reality of birth, like not something that we've personally experienced, so do your research, it's not as sterile or as silent or as peaceful as we might have turned it into.
Yeah. But what's interesting though, is two single men, Jesus and Paul, both use that concept of the pains of childbirth.
Right. That's true.
To frame up the whole
their
epoch
eschatology,
we're in, as we're longing and waiting, so there is a universal human quality to it. We all been through this.
Yeah.
And we're all in it. We're all longing and waiting. And so it is, it's a beautiful and confusing thing that God would use this method.
Do you correct people on the wise men? Do you slap their hands and say, get them out of the nativity scene? Come on.
That's that's another misconception. I think, the kind of the compression of time of it all, to make it all fit within the confines of a Christmas program.
Yeah.
It's all compressed, but we're talking probably a couple years. Why did Herod issue the order to be between the birth and age 2?
Yeah.
Let's
see. I don't mind them being
even if
there.
we split the difference, it's 1.
Yeah.
He's 1 when it happens.
Personally, I don't mind them being there.
Okay.
Because they're
like aesthetically?
Yeah. Because
I appreciate you weighing in on that.
They're associated with the birth story of Jesus. Yeah. So being associated with it,
We just put them in the kitchen.
We'll let them.
But again, capturing the grittiness. Who's actually there?
Yeah.
Shepherds.
Right.
The lowly.
Mm-hmm.
Are the first witnesses.
Yeah.
So of course the Magi,
not the kings. Yeah. You're right.
They've got gold and exotic spices.
Yeah.
They're there too, and they worship too.
Maybe in another room of the house, there needs to be a secondary. Well, you wouldn't even call it a nativity scene, but a secondary scene. They have a toddler Jesus.
Yeah.
So you don't have the baby, but you have a toddler Jesus being attended to by them.
That's super funny.
So but a lot of people. Actually, they're like Ricky Bobby on Talladega Nights. I don't know. I like little sweet 8-pound baby Jesus. That's my Jesus. I like the baby one.
Yeah.
So speaking of the wise men, actually, I want to ask a specific question about them.
Mm-hmm.
The next, one of the things that we love to talk about are the different gospels, and so I'm going to give you a collection of questions, and then do what you want with them in terms of order. We'd love to know what are some things Matthew and Luke. Matthew and Luke tell the Christmas birth narrative. What are some things they share in common? What are some of the unique pieces? And I'd really love to hear, if you don't mind, what's your quick interpretation of why are the Magi important, as an example? Okay. And then the very next question, and if you need me to remind you again, because you say a lot on that, that's fine. How is our theology of Christmas or our understanding of Christmas weakened if we ignore the contributions of Mark and John?
Yeah.
So kind of touch on all four.
Okay, great. Yeah, so when I think of what Matthew and Luke have in common, there is... this absolute organic, integral connection with the God of the Old Testament. Mm-hmm. I mean, what God is acting as God does for his purposes.
Yeah.
And it just comes on so strong in both of those, whether it's through, the Zechariah, John the Baptist stuff, the Elijah connections, or in the case of Matthew, a genealogy and then explicit fulfillment texts. Yeah. This fulfills what was predicted. Yeah. I mean, just a very strong bond there. And that while, yes, 400 some years and have passed, God is following through on what he said he would do. And so they really, I think both of those authors accent that point in their own way. In some pretty strong ways. I mean, and again, we've touched on it, but with John the Baptist, almost in some sense embodying that. Yeah. Sort of personifying the segue between the old and the new, kind of that baton pass. And I've heard some people say, even kind of trick question: who's the last Old Testament prophet? Yes, yeah. Is it Malachi? No, it's John the Baptist. And I think that's actually accurate. Old Covenant, man. It's kind of playful, but it's actually accurate. I think to say that in covenantal talk, he's the last of his kind. That's why Jesus said there hasn't been anybody greater, born of a woman, but the least in the kingdom is greater than him. I don't think that means morally superior or smarter, but experiencing greater measure of the plan of God unfolding. So he was the closest you got until now that I'm here. So bridging those, I think, is really one of the interests, again, guided by God, that Matthew and Luke both make in their own way. That's a big one. I mean, kind of thinking about each one, maybe the neglect that would come from Mark and John, as Chad was saying. I mean, Mark comes on strong with Jesus being God. Of course, it's a textual variant even in verse 1 about the Son of God.
I think it's there, though, because of the bracketing with the centurion and the way in which how you have the centurion, you have the baptism, the transfiguration, but
I can go with that too. Yeah, I can see it as in there, and even if it's not, the very first thing is to quote from Isaiah, preparing the way for the Lord, preparing the way for Yahweh. That's John the Baptist's job, and so that kind of very strong divinity in Mark, and then of course John. Yes. I mean, it's you don't get out of chapter 1 before he says he is God. Yeah. He was with God. He is God. He's known God, or he's had the closest relationship with God, and is himself God. I mean, so a really high view, high Christology that we should have in the birth narrative. Yeah. And again, sometimes I wonder, would the average, sort of I come to Christmas once a year, would they actually see Jesus as God? Yeah. That sounds strange, but I think the gift of God, the reason for the season, the greatest gift ever given, but that he is God. Yeah.
That's why I love the, it's not a birth narrative or a birth text, but the prologue in Hebrews,
Mhm.
Oh, it's beautiful.
which parallels John 1 in
Right.
some striking ways,
Absolutely.
and also Colossians 1.
Mhm.
Right.
It doesn't allow you to have this sentimentalized Jesus. It simply doesn't allow it.
That's
Right.
cool.
He's the exact representation of God's being.
It's revealing God.
Yeah, the
here.
radiance of his glory,
Mhm.
and the creator and sustainer of everything that exists.
Right. So
Right?
sweet little baby Jesus
Yes.
is the sustainer of all creation.
It just does not allow the sentimentalized Jesus
Right.
to develop.
Right.
And Hebrews doesn't even mention the birth, but Hebrews does mention he provided purification for sins, and after he did that, he sat down.
Yeah.
You know, and so Hebrews ain't messing around. And it seems like, John in much the same way. It's like, no,
Right.
you need a better picture, a more accurate picture of
Right.
who this Jesus is.
Right. And you get the mention of, making him a little lower than the angels,
Yes.
and incarnation
Mhm.
interpretation. But yeah, so you get this, again, harmony or sort of in concert with one another that I think is beautiful.
Yeah.
And so God gave it all to us,
Yeah.
so they're not against each other. But yeah, if we don't include all those in our formation of our thinking about it, and even in our preaching and teaching, there probably is a deficit. God wanted us to have all these for a reason, I think.
Don't you sometimes get made uncomfortable by you mentioned like recovering, or maybe recovering is the wrong word, acknowledging the grittiness, the reality of the day and stuff like that. I got to confess, I struggle with preachers who take that too far sometimes, though, like talk about changing the God of the universe's diaper and, stuff like that. It's just, like there's this irreverence that sometimes seems to creep in a little bit. Like when some people, like they're so willful and intentional, like we've got to bring this down to earth and make sure that people get how real this is. There is something sanctified and sacred about this moment too, and I don't know,
God with us.
Yeah.
This is God with us.
Just kind of makes me uncomfortable
Well, I think
the
for
way
me,
we talk about it.
It's a little bit
sometimes.
about the way that's being presented. Like I even think that it's a really weird specific, but like that his diapers needed changing.
Yeah.
Like said, junior high boyish or
Right.
whatever. No offense, junior
Right.
high boys. But then it's like, what are we doing? But
Right.
said in a
No,
mature way,
much
like
offense to them.
exactly, yeah.
I have
like,
two.
yeah, no doubt. Like think about the fact
Yeah.
that literally, like, Mama had to change his diaper.
I guess
like,
it is
that
the
can be
spirit of it,
meaningful,
isn't
but
it?
is that what?
It's-
At
yeah,
least
it's
that's what
the-
I sense.
It's
and
the
feel.
spirit of it.
Yeah.
Like sometimes it just comes out like you're just kind of being a hack.
Yeah.
You're just kind of, for the shock of
Cheap
it.
joke, cheap crass. Yeah.
Yeah, I hear you on that. I think the part that's hard for me is that maybe it sounds like I'm even talking out of both sides of my mouth with this divinity element at the birth, but I do think that a lot of people have a hard time believing that Jesus was actually
real, actual.
human.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Like it's still kind of superhero fantasy,
Yeah.
Right.
for a lot of people.
Well, I
think that's true.
remember when we were doing a series back when I was searching at Real Life, and we asked some different folks in the church who've been going for a while, like, what do you think people think of when they think of Jesus? Why do people have a hard time understanding Jesus? And this one particular couple both worked in the entertainment industry, and they said, well, Jesus has no arc.
Yeah.
Like, what do you mean? And they're like,
Right.
well, he just kind of comes fully God, and
Yeah.
it's just everything was easy for him.
Interesting.
And there's a lot of Catholic, I'm
Yeah.
not blaming Roman Catholicism as if they don't present Jesus in his real humanity, but their kind of cheap experience of that, and it led to that. And so that's what we ended up doing a focus on. Okay, like Jesus, a real person,
Yeah, he
looking at him.
grew.
Yeah.
He learned.
Yeah.
It actually says.
Yeah.
He grew in wisdom.
I had a young lady after class today ask me, did Jesus struggle to be faithful to who he was? Did he struggle with who he was? And I said, well, do you struggle with God's calling on your life?
Yeah.
She's like, well, yeah. And I said, well, when you look at the Garden of Gethsemane, you got grown up Jesus. Does it look like it's easy for him?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I wasn't being sarcastic
Yeah,
at
but
all.
there's a real paradoxical
Yeah,
thing there.
there
Like,
is.
Jesus
That,
at 12 knows who he is.
Yes.
But
That growing in wisdom
He
and
has to grow.
stature,
Something.
that growing in wisdom and stature verse is one of the more profound verses
It is.
in the Gospels.
It really
it
is.
is.
So look, I want to talk a bit. We may not get through all of what we want to talk through, which is fine. We'll just have another episode sometime. But I want to talk through some of the theology stuff. But let's
Yeah.
pause. Let's take a mental break and do some silly stuff. So
Okay.
we're going to come at you speed round, okay?
Okay,
We're just
uh-oh.
going to ask a bunch of questions. So literally, don't overthink it. Just
Okay.
first thing that comes to mind. So
I
you grew
don't
up on the
trust
West.
myself with that.
I know, right? Yeah, I'll try to keep it PG. You grew up on the. Almost on all sorts of funny questions. I'm not going to ask. You grew up on the West Coast.
Yeah.
What do you miss most about living on the West Coast?
Oh man, ocean, diversity of outlook and background. Those are the big ones.
Okay, yeah. So you lived in Japan for, I can't remember how many years you were there.
About 5.
Okay. What food do you most miss eating? I think I know what it is.
Well, it's got to be sushi, actually.
Okay. Okay.
Because it's different and it's cheap
Mm-hmm.
and yeah. But maybe what are you thinking of?
The curry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
See, the thing is, I mean, when there's not a pandemic, I can actually get that now.
Okay, nice.
I go with room in my suitcase to bring back ridiculous
bunch of
amounts
them?
of curry.
That's
in
awesome.
my
Really?
suitcase.
Oh yeah, that's so funny.
Because I can travel.
Oh yeah.
So
But fresh sushi can't.
so I'm not a sushi guy.
Okay.
Is it a cheap food? Like I always
can be.
associated it with cost. Like
Well,
this is
I like to think of it as almost like there's different burgers. you
Yeah,
know,
I wonder if
right,
you're going to
okay.
go there.
You can
huh?
get a McDonald's burger.
Yeah.
You know, when I was a kid, I remember 39-cent cheeseburgers on Sunday.
oh yeah.
For McDonald's,
Yeah.
but you could also go to, a high-end place,
Gourmet,
and gourmet
yeah,
burger,
right,
you
right.
know, and so there's a range.
Okay.
And they have a rating system of the qualities of fish and that drives a lot of that. And it's the chef and the location
Right.
and all those types of things. But no, it can be a normal food that you have regularly. Even as a family of 5, we could go to sushi, get some cheap sushi,
Do it. Yeah.
get the McDonald's equivalent of
That's
sushi.
funny. Yeah. All right, got a bunch of favorites for you.
Okay.
Favorite drink.
Arnold Palmer.
Oh, nice. I did not know that.
Yeah.
That's awesome, man.
It's got to be unsweet tea, though.
Okay. Yeah.
Ooh.
Otherwise, it's too much.
Too much.
I'm
yeah.
with you on that. That's fun. Oh man, my mind just blanked. I'll go to another one I was going to ask in a second. Oh no, favorite smell. It's a weird question.
Lemongrass.
Huh. Okay.
Maybe.
Okay. Yeah, you might think of something later. Favorite book, and you can categorize and pick a couple if you want.
Oh, man, that's a.
How do you ask?
That's
I
a
know,
mean
dude. I'm
one.
sorry.
That
I'm
one's
sorry.
actually mean.
I can just say fiction. I don't know if you read much fiction.
Do you read much fiction?
Not much.
Okay.
No. But probably my all-time favorite fiction book I've read is Maniac McGee. That's when I
What?
was a kid.
Awesome.
You read that?
No, I don't know what that is, but that's so great.
Oh, check it
It
out.
sounds like a
Okay.
5th grade reader.
Don't knock it till you try
I'm
it.
not knocking it at all.
Actually, it's one of those I
Maniac
had my
Mickey.
kids read it, and I go back, and it's actually kind of like a modern version of Huck Finn
Okay.
without the like inappropriate
Without the
racial
problematicness.
language.
Yeah.
Yeah. Honestly, it's actually a lot more about
Maniac
classism
McGee.
and racism than I realized.
Yeah.
It's about a kid that runs everywhere, but actually, there's a lot more to it. But especially if you think about favorite in terms of what book have I most thought about in life.
Yeah. Maniac McGee.
Wow.
That's
That's
awesome.
crazy.
If you
I
had
think
to,
about that book every time I walk slowly across the street. You have to read it to
that's
understand.
so funny.
But yeah.
Oh man, no, I don't want to ask that question. I was going to ask about what book would you burn. Do you believe in aliens?
No.
Okay, we haven't had anybody say yes
But
yet.
if they
No, we did.
Who?
I thought didn't Alan?
Oh, maybe
Noble
he did.
I
I
think
can't
he said
remember.
he did.
But
I don't know.
I'll clarify based on 1 Corinthians 6, if they exist, I believe that we judge them.
Nice. Okay.
I believe that we are God's most superior
Right.
being.
Yeah. And based on Colossians 1, you'd say that the redemption that they require is made available in Jesus. Yeah. Right.
If that's even
A
the
thing?
way if they're a high enough life form to need
Redemption in
in the same way.
Yeah. That's awesome. Okay.
So I feel
That's
like
that's a good clarifier. Of course,
Yeah.
if we ever met life in the universe, I imagine they would be coming to us. You know,
Why?
so
That's interesting, man.
I mean, because we haven't developed the capacity to go to them. You know,
Yet.
outside of you know, but yeah, if they have the capacity to come to us, then they would be certainly sentient.
right.
So
but my theological anthropology, based on Scripture as I see it, is that we are unique among God's creatures.
Yeah.
And that we're at the top of the
The
heap
apex.
in stewarding the universe.
Yeah.
And so if they're out there,
Yeah.
we're still top
That's
dog.
awesome. Last
Mm.
one for me. No qualifications or caveats. Do you think the average person in the pew thinks about angels and demons too much or too little? I would hate to be on the other side of a stupid question like this, but I just want to hear it. I'm curious.
See, my conflicting backgrounds come out.
I know.
I'm not supposed to caveat. My charismatic background is too much.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
My independent Christian church background is not enough.
Mm.
So I broke the rules
I'll
with a
allow it.
caveat there. But
I like the question. Chad, what do you got for him?
So here's my question. What do you enjoy the most about being a ball coach?
That's awesome.
Well, I love football, so it gets me, I love football. But no, it gets me connected to the community.
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard, working
Now your son's what age?
Well, I coached my oldest son who's a freshman, so for 4 years.
So not coaching him anymore.
No,
but
now I've done 2 years so far with my youngest son.
Right.
So 6 years total.
Okay.
So it's quite a run, but no, the connection with the community. I mean, it's hard when our job is kind of in this insular environment on campus where, we live in different towns from one another, maybe as colleagues, and then our students are from all over.
Right.
It's pretty difficult to get connected in the way other jobs would more incorporate you in the community.
How'd you guys finish up this year?
We lost.
Did you lose the Super Bowl? Oh no!
Yeah.
To the other web team.
Yeah. So we went undefeated in the regular season. We lost the Super Bowl by
it's a bummer.
2 touchdowns.
You know what? But my sons, I think that we might have won like 3 games from when do we start? 3rd grade?
Yeah.
Like from 3rd to 6th grade, I think we won like 3 or 4 games. We were bad.
It's all about the fundamentals.
Yeah.
And a lot of towns, I mean, now I sound like a Web City dad.
That's all right. You are a
a
Web
lot
City
of these
dad.
towns, they have an A team and a B team.
Oh yeah.
And we don't. We just do split them up. And, and so that's why when you see them merge together, that's when the differences come out.
That's funny. Well, man, I just look at the clock. We are pretty much up against time.
Oh,
So
wow.
we're going to have to save a lot of the theological questions for another one. And I really would love to kind of right now invite you back at some point because I so want to talk through these questions. I'm kind of bummed, but
Fortunately, he's local.
It's
Yeah.
true.
So,
yeah, that's great. But I would love to, I guess not so much in the frame of advice, but encouragement, thinking about preachers. And by the time this drops, I think most will probably have their sermons written.
Okay.
So maybe, but I don't know. I don't know, not those who wait till the last minute, probably. What preachers preach Christmas sermons every year.
Yeah.
And, obviously you're not in that role right now, so we're sharing from the outside. But what encouragement would you offer them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one would be that, don't feel like you need to reinvent the wheel with this because it is so many people's one time per year to be at church or for regular, even people who are there all year, they're one time per year to ponder the birth narratives.
Yeah, that's
unless
true.
you're preaching them elsewhere. Be okay with sort of a straight presentation of it. I think as preachers, we feel, but I already did this. And, I want to spruce this up. Or, you're maybe overemphasizing the well-established believer who's heard every one of yours.
Yeah. Yes.
And you want to make them happy too.
Right.
I'd say tune them out. They're fine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Be okay with giving a clear gospel presentation from these narratives. And of course, I mean by that the death and resurrection as well, being included there, some of the things we were talking about. But at least in those inclusio ways, we were talking about it a little bit. But that burden to always innovate. I hope we have that in a lot of ways in church and in ministry. But I think with something like this, be all right with saying, I want to just tell you what this is. So that'd be one. I think some of my encouragement is probably implicit in what we've been talking about in terms of seeing the connections with the covenants. It's fresh on my mind. My text today was about the new wine and new wineskins and, the cloth in the needing to be pre-shrunken before patching. And, there's various ways those texts are used, but I think that there really is a sense in which the continuity and discontinuity of God's plan is really what's in view there, especially even when you see what's been coming before and what's coming after. He says that. I mean, he goes right into Sabbath healings and discussions to sort of say, I'm doing a new thing. If you would realize what's here, But I think sometimes we overstate that newness.
Yeah.
That sounds weird.
No, I know what you're
it's,
saying.
It's kind of like accidentally Marcion. I think all three of us have talked about that before. Kind of latent Marcionism.
Yeah.
Old was bad.
Right.
In fact,
Something good's finally here. Yeah.
When Jesus talks about the wine thing, he says, people prefer the old wine.
Yeah.
Anyone who's out there, not around here, of course, that drinks wine. Of course, old wine's better.
Yeah.
Familiar.
Yeah.
Richer.
Yes.
But I think actually a lot of us New Testament preachers need to be reminded that it's the same God.
Yeah.
It's the same promises. And so showing people that consistency in the character of God, even if something obviously cataclysmically new is happening, isn't God at work like he does? That's even Mary's song. One of the striking things about Mary's song when she's, pondering the conception and birth of this eventual child is, it actually reads like an Old Testament psalm celebrating the faithfulness of God to Jacob. She mentions remembering Jacob, just grounding it absolutely in the promises of God all along. Yeah. And just showing it kind of as contiguous and consistent. Yeah. I think that's something to help people with, since they tend to not see it that way.
Right.
Strong contrast. So
love it. Well, is there anything that you anticipated saying in relation to any of the other questions that we're not getting to that you feel like needs to be said for this episode to not be conceptually incomplete?
Well,
or have you found a way to say it in other ways?
We gotten some of it out there, but I think the thing we touched on earlier, and we had talked before about maybe bringing in like what Christological heresies.
Yeah.
I think most of the folks in our churches are accidentally Docetist.
Yeah, don't think he's okay.
I don't think he's quite human. That's why, and maybe we see that a little different, Chad, but it's like, the way I've described
I think you're
it
right.
to students.
I think it's in the correction of that where maybe we almost become too flippant.
Yeah. So, and I totally hear you on that, even in the tone of it, but it's almost like I've explained it to students, like without even realizing it, I thought maybe Jesus hovered off the ground like an inch.
Yes.
He's almost one of us.
Yeah.
But the humanity of Jesus as absolutely how the Gospels present him, and as essential to our atonement theology.
Yes.
I think a lot of people don't sense that kind of logically, coherently, we need him to be human. I know we can't do air quotes on here, but it's like it's necessary for his atoning as a substitution, as a high priest for us, thinking of Hebrews. And so teaching Jesus in the Gospels as fully divine, fully human, just being okay with that.
Yeah.
And that not accidentally holding Docetistic conceptions of him. Yeah. That somehow he's just not quite one of us.
It's good.
It's hard. It's hard to hold those intentions.
Well, but that's the call, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, Mike, we'll definitely make plans to have you on.
Seriously,
again soon. Maybe next semester.
Maybe I'll come out of hiding.
Yeah. For those of you who don't know, Doug is coming off of sabbatical here in a couple weeks, and Mr. DeFazio is going on sabbatical.
You're going to be able to listen to this thing on triple speed.
Yeah. So, anyway, Mike, thanks for being here.
Thank you, guys.
And for Michael and for Jeff, I'm Chad. We'll keep this conversation going next time.